Hello and welcome to Majestic Chat. I'm very excited today because we have Storm Faerywolf here. I can't tell you how happy I am. Um, this is a person who I've looked up to. I've read all his books. I follow him on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook. I'm your very own personal stalker. I keep up with you. I just think you're brilliant. But before we introduce Storm officially, let me introduce my co-host. Well, let me introduce myself first of all. I just got so excited. My name is Chris Allen. I am a published author and a minister for the Fellowship of the Phoenix. And I'm also a massage therapist and working holistic healing and wellness. So everything I do comes from an open heart, I hope, and I try. I would like to introduce Laura Gonzalez. Laura, introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Laura Gonzalez. I am a minister of the goddess and I'm a minister with Circle Sanctuary. And I'm also a podcaster. I do Lunatic Mondays and Paganos del Mundo and produce a bilingual podcast. And I also do Mystic Chat. And I'm a professional tarot reader. And I think that's it for today.
And
I'm a witch for hire, of course. Pew, pew.
Pew, pew.
And I am very delighted to introduce the one and only Ruby Ruse.
Thank you so much. My name is Ruby Ruse. I am a YouTube artist that talks about pagan themes with a fairy themed bent towards it. So I'm very excited to have Storm Faerywolf with us here today. He is certainly the expert beyond my very tiny Fairy Fortunes YouTube channel. So without further ado, the person that you've all been waiting for, I'm very honored and pleased to be able to introduce Storm Faerywolf.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. What's your thing? What's your jam? Like, tell us what makes you and in the pagan magical witch community.
Well, I think that I don't know. My big thing in my whole life has always been that I've been drawn to witchcraft. And I think like so many of us were drawn to the craft and to magic from an early age. And for many different reasons, but I do think that one common reason is that we have a sense of otherness, that we discover early on. And, I was always kind of the outcast kid. I was always, I think stereotypically the terms would be, I was a rather effeminate child. And so I was asked every day up through third grade if I was a boy or a girl. And at the time, that really bothered me. That doesn't bother me at all anymore. I think that that's an awesome thing. But I had this idea that my sense of otherness early on was my interest in magic. And then later, when I discovered my sexuality, I thought, oh, well, that's it. It's me being queer. And then realized, nope, it's not exactly that. I mean, that's part of it, but that's not exactly it either, because then I would hang out with other gay men and I was like, yeah, no, we're not the same. We're not part of the same group. There's a Venn diagram there, but no, this is not the whole thing. So I do think that like that sense of otherness, I was always queer in the larger sense of the term, not just in the sexual sense of the term. But when I say queer, to me, that's an inclusive term, because it's anybody that doesn't follow the mainstream, on some level, if you feel different. And so in my definition, all witches are queer, because we don't follow the mainstream. You could be heterosexual and you could still be queer, because if you're a witch, you ain't doing what the whole world says you should be doing, right? And I think it takes a lot of guts to do it anyway, right? So I don't know, that's kind of my thing. Early on in my studies of the craft, I was drawn to the Feri Tradition. And that's a very specific thing that I'll have to define. I know it's, I often will say that the Feri Tradition is a branding nightmare, because there are so many different paths that relate to the Fae on some level. And the one that I'm talking about is actually a very specific tradition of American witchcraft.
Mm.
It's a lineaged tradition that goes back to the teachings of the late Victor and Cora Anderson. If you're not familiar with it, I might say, hey, remember back when you read The Spiral Dance, by Starhawk? She talked about the Feri tradition. She was an initiate, or is an initiate, in the Feri tradition. And she talks a little bit about it and a little bit about Victor. But when I was like 19 or so, I read that book, and she talked about Victor Anderson, the blind poet and shaman. And there was just something that was so like literally magical. It was just like something came over me, and I was like, oh, I have to know more about this. This is amazing. And it was like there was something in my blood. There was something that just called to me, and then she talked a little bit about the blue god in Feri, Johnny Glass. And I think she described him as the laughing god of love. I really should go back and look at that book again.
I think she did.
Years.
That sounds familiar to me.
The laughing god of love. And it was just, I was like, oh, that's my jam. That is what I'm about, and that's really what drew me to the Feri tradition. And then you fast forward years later, there was an acquaintance of mine that like found a teacher in the Berkeley, California area. And then I ended up taking classes with that person for a few months. And actually, my husband, Chaz Began, he wasn't my husband at the time, but he started going to these classes with me as well. We were in our early 20s though. And so we weren't exactly the most stable people. And the class kept getting started over, and she would let new people come and we were like, okay, well, I'm kind of over this. Yeah. It keeps starting over. So we would just go out to dinner. But then a couple years later, that same acquaintance like showed up again, like magically, and said, oh, there's this other teacher in Berkeley who's teaching, Feri classes, and like, oh, okay, let's try it out. And that was the one that stuck. And so I trained with this person. I would go to his house every week and sit, with him in his room for, 2 hours or whatever. And eventually got initiated. I trained with him for about 5.5 years. So it wasn't a small thing. And that's kind of par for the course, I would say, in Feri. But yeah, my big thing tends to be the Feri tradition. Some people call it Anderson Feri to kind of differentiate it. Victor in the 1990s, he started spelling it Feri in order to try to differentiate it, from all the myriad of other Feri things going on. When I first came to it, it was Faery, but really it's an oral tradition. And so it's the sound, it's not the spelling. But I will admit that, I used Feri for a while. It just never really gelled with me because it really seemed forced. And it seemed like, I don't know, it was like, kind of like, what, you don't even care about spelling? I don't know. It was just a little weird for me. So I've gone back to spelling it Faery. And that's also why I took that into my name and into my magical name, Faerywolf, which references a couple trance experiences and dreams that I had early on. But in our lineage, I was trained in what is called Blood Rose. My own lineage is called Blue Rose. But in our lineage, we actually did have some work with the folkloric fae. And I will say, that's not universal in our witchcraft tradition. There are lineages of our tradition that don't work directly with the fae, or at least they don't think they do. That's a whole other.
Can we talk about that for a second? Because I know everyone's like on the edge of their seat, waiting to find out what's going on. So can you explain the difference than, say, like the fairy folklore in the Elfar and things like that, versus how you do your fairy witchcraft, Feri? Like, what's the difference, or what's the same?
Well, I would say there's definitely, I'll say it again, a Venn diagram, right? There is a crossover. As I learned fairy witchcraft tradition, again, we did have an element of working with the folkloric fae. So it never seemed out of place to me. I would later hear from other people from other lineages who didn't work with the fae. And I was always puzzled. I'm like, how can you be practicing the fairy tradition and not work with the fae? and again, I think that you kind of are. It depends on how you're looking at the Fae. You know, I think a lot of people say, oh, it's a very specific thing, right? It's a very culturally specific thing. We might think of, you know, British Isles, you know, Ireland and Wales. That's usually where we get the term. That's where we associate it. But really, the word fairy, really, if you trace it back, it really just meant things of magic and enchantment, you know, and so that kind of opens up the door a lot. But even if you're looking at just the folkloric Fae, one of the things I think that is so much a common denominator in that current is its sense of being nebulous, of being liminal, right? It's neither here nor there, you know, it's kind of always in between. And this really kind of resonates with me working in a spiritual witchcraft system that purports to be a mystery tradition. You know, so to me, it really is about the mystery. I'm not here to kind of to try to pin it down, or to try to, you know, use my talk or my ego brain to, like, you know, oh, let's figure it out and put it in a flow chart and, you know, whatever, and, you know, hierarchy. I kind of feel that, you know, nature kind of thumbs its nose at flow charts. You know, yes, there's an order to things, but it's so vast and mysterious, and we're always learning new things. I have to be a little bit okay with the mystery. But yeah, there are people in Anderson Ferry that don't work directly with the Fae. But again, I feel like you kind of are, because if you're working with magic and enchantment, you know, and you're working with spirits, I mean, you can make the argument that, like, well, gods are Fae. You know, if we're talking about just things that are magical, things that are mysterious, they're beyond our limited human consciousness. You know, I get very reticent to try to pin them down. What's the difference between a god and an angel? Marketing, pretty much, I think. So I don't know. People will often ask me, like, well, how do you work with the Fae? Well, I mean, lots of different ways, but I think that the first thing that people would want to do is to enter into a respectful relationship with nature. Because I do really feel like when we're talking about, like, oh, working with the fairy beings, if we're going to put a fine point on it, I think the first way to approach them would be the spirits of nature, right?
Yeah.
I think it's more than that, but that's a good entry point. And I think especially now, you know, hello, like climate change and all of that, I feel like we need to spiritualize our relationship with nature, no matter where we are, even if you're living like me in the suburbs, you know, go out in your backyard, you know, that's nature too. We have something like 21 trees on our, and we teeny yard. I mean, we live in the suburbs, you know, and in the San
Wait, how do you
Francisco
have
Bay Area.
21 trees? Are they teeny trees or are they big trees?
No, I got big and small trees, big and small trees. We have 4 sequoia trees in our backyard, and those are brilliant. We did have a willow tree, but sadly, I live in California and we had a horrible drought and it died. And so, but actually Devin, my partner Devin, cut it down, and we have a beautiful altar made out of the stump.
Ooh, that's cool.
It was extra nice because actually when my husband and I got married, we got married underneath that tree. So I was quite sad when we couldn't save it. But it was just, there was no way to keep giving it enough water during that drought. It was horrible.
You know, it's interesting that you're talking about like fairy means enchantment and things like that, because when I was doing research for my last book, I was like, I wanted to look at the folklore, and one of the things that popped up over and over and over again is like in the Middle Ages, in the Celtic countries, every spirit was called a fairy. Everything, like everything from a nature spirit to an animal spirit to, like you said, even a god, which that's where we get the confusion of, because in the folklore, especially the Irish folklore, fairies are tall and they're big and bright, and then we have, you know, the Victorian, like little teeny thing, but to those people, it's all fairies. So what you're saying makes complete sense, like completely to me. But I think it helps to have that context about why is it all fairy? What does that mean? Because it means I don't even think they used the term witchcraft. It was more enchantment, magical dream, fascination, things like that, right?
Well, there
Something
was
beyond.
also, I will say that, in Ireland, there was the term fairy doctor
Hmm.
that was often used. And this might be the person who you'd think of as like a wise woman or a cunning man, so especially in Ireland, there was that rich connection with, oh, if they're working with magic, then they're working with the Fae. That was full stop. That
Is
was
that
just,
it?
everybody knows that,
Yeah.
right? And but there was also kind of that idea that, like, well, the fairy doctor themselves, are they in league with the Fae, or are they actually Fae themselves? And I think that this was a distinction that the fairy doctor um, kept ambiguous, exploited that on purpose, because on one level, it kept you in awe of them and you better not cross them, right? And it probably also kind of kept them protected, on some level. If you were afraid, so, oh, they might put a fairy curse on me, whatever, maybe you're going to be a little nicer, and not mess with them. And actually, the term fairy doctor, that's actually how the Anderson fairy witchcraft tradition got its name.
Really? I didn't
It's
I know that.
it was said to have been accidentally named fairy. So that would have happened sometime probably in the 1960s. Victor Anderson claimed that he was initiated as a child. And if you want to get that story, I would really recommend Margot Adler's Drawing Down the Moon,
Mhm.
originally published in 1979. She had the first interview with Victor, and that was pretty rich and amazing. I do talk about it in my book. I'm going to shamelessly plug my
No,
book if you
please,
don't
plug
mind.
away, plug away. I love
So
it.
this is Betwixt and Between, Exploring the Fairy Tradition of Witchcraft. And this was my first book with Llewellyn, and I go into the history of the tradition, basic practices. I actually use it as a textbook for my practitioner level in Blue Rose. Had to rewrite a lot of material, of course, because fairy is an oral tradition. And I don't know who wrote all of those invocations and whatnot. I know I didn't. So I rewrote a lot of stuff for the book. But I recommend checking out Drawing Down the Moon, and that will give you an idea of Victor's background. So he said he was 9 years old, when he was initiated by a woman in the woods, right? And I actually think this was probably a dream or a trance experience. Until his death, he claimed otherwise. He said it was absolutely true. But then later, when he was about 15, he said he was actually initiated into a coven called the Harpy Coven, and they were in Southern Oregon. And he said that they broke up around World War II. And so, and then he moved to Northern California, to the Bay Area. And that's where they bought a house, him and his wife, Cora. And sometime in the 50s and 60s is when they started teaching. And that's really where I feel like it gelled into what we understand as the fairy tradition today, because it was rather nebulous. A lot of the teachings were really just Victor himself as a spirit worker. He would go off on the astral and he would work with these spirits, and people would ask him questions. And he was a poet. He was an award-winning poet, and wrote a book, actually a couple books on poetry. His first one was Thorns of the Blood Rose. And a lot of that material actually got worked into what is understood as fairy liturgy, today. But it was very nebulous, even some of the exercises that we take for granted, in fairy, like those of you who are familiar with this tradition will recognize when I say the Iron Pentacle. It's kind of a staple of fairy tradition. And then later, the reclaiming tradition, of course, took a lot of those teachings and developed them in their own way. But we today take for granted that we have these ways of working with it. Oh, I can run energy and I draw this star in my body, and these 5 points mean this, and it's this order, and blah blah blah. And that really didn't exist, early on. Victor just said, "Here are the points. Go meditate on it." Right? He didn't really tell you how to do anything, because to him it just came natural. And so other people had to kind of pick up those pieces and those ideas and figure out, how are we going to create a workable system, through this. So fairy the tradition they follow, Feri, is always evolving, and it's much more concerned with an inner experience than it is about any sort of outer form.
That's interesting. So from what I know about Feri, which to be honest is about this much in your book, I didn't, from what I know, you may not be able to tell us all the ins and outs, but can you tell us a little bit about what that means to have experience on the inner planes?
Yeah, so one of the things that really struck me about this tradition in particular, and I don't mean to like downplay anybody else's tradition, I'm just speaking about my own experiences, but I had experienced different versions of Wicca, and I do even have a couple initiations in various versions of initiatory Wicca, but they really didn't speak to me. It just, to me, it didn't feel like there was power there. And I'm not saying that there's not power there. What I'm saying is that it didn't resonate with me. And so it didn't ignite the power in me. I have friends who are Gardnerian who absolutely feel the power in that current and that egregore because it speaks to them. And that's how, and I would assume that they would come to Feri and they'd be like, I don't know what this is. This is just crazy, But to me, Feri tradition was so much about a personal practice. It wasn't just about these rituals. It was about working with spirits. It was about having a personal relationship with these spirits and with a current of energy. That is one thing in our initiatory tradition. One of the things that characterizes our lineage is this practice of working with what we call the Feri power, or the Feri current, a current, we will say, of mystical energy that is handed down from initiate to student. And we can trace it all back to the late Victor Anderson, and presumably beyond, into his poetic history, but definitely to Victor, because he was at least somebody we could point to that was tangible. But it was definitely something that was about developing your soul. I often say that Feri is a sorceress path of soul development, because it gives us these tools to work with our complexes, to really do introspective work, to work with the shadow, and to try to make ourselves a worthy vessel, for this power. Because the idea is, of course, that once you're initiated and you're brought into the full presence of this power, it empowers all parts of you, not just the parts that are nice or healthy. And I will say that I do have some criticism of our community, because I do think that we can have some very unhealthy individuals who are now very empowered. And so their health issues are also empowered. And so we definitely have some controversy there.
I'm a massage therapist, I'm a Reiki master, blah, blah, blah. And so my thoughts, it's all about holistic healing. And I came to that conclusion 20 years ago because I would see these wonderful, powerful spiritual people, but then there was all these health concerns and things like that. Brilliant, powerful. Like one of my very close friends, like 25 years ago, he was a high priest. He initiated a lot of people, but unfortunately, he passed away of a lot of health problems at 50 years old. I mean, I'm 45 now, so that just makes me say, hey, we have to be, one of my friends and colleagues, he says you have to, to be a witch, you have to dance in the 4 elements. So you have to take care of your mind, take care of your spirit, take care of your emotions, and take care of your body. I'm just like, oh, I like that, dance in the 4 elements, so I really resonate with what you're saying, that we need to take care of ourselves. We need to work on our shadow and do, I think there's this stereotype of the witches being able to do anything, any pleasure, any decadence, and we can, but still watch our health. Let's be happy, let's be healthy, because I want everyone here a long time.
I hear you. I mean, it is, of course, on one level easier said than done. I have, I'll be 50 next month. And probably when I turned 40 is when I started really kind of suffering with IBS, and didn't really know that that's what it was, at the time. And, it would flare up at different times. And it's been quite a journey for me, to kind of figure out, and I'm still doing it. Actually, right now I'm on that elimination diet, which means I can't have 6 key things, basically, flavor, and so eating a lot of salads, and I am feeling better, but it's one of those things. I was so I just loved food. I just loved food. And I loved dairy. Oh my God. I loved ice cream and pizza. And that was the first thing that had to go, right? And pretty much the rule of thumb was just okay, well, what are the foods that you love? Okay, those are gone. You just get rid of those immediately, right? They're killing you. And so I had to do that. But then I realized there's more, there's more to this, right? And I think we all have our own shadow. We can be really good at certain things, right? And then totally blind on others. I look back now and I'm just why was I doing this for so long? I mean, yeah, food's delicious, but have you ever tried just healthy living? Just not being in pain, all the time. And when I gave up dairy, so many of my friends would be like, "Oh my God, you have such great willpower." I was like, "No, I don't have such great willpower. This is terror. This is fear that is motivating me, because I'm sick of being doubled over in pain, right?" And yet I feel like I can be healthy in all these other areas of my life, so we all have our own pitfalls, right? And they will show up at different times. And no matter how advanced you think you are, you're not.
Let me tell
life will tell you.
One of the hardest lessons that I learned in magic was that it is easier to get what you want rather than to know what you want. And everybody thinks they know what they want, but sometimes what we say we want, we actually want the opposite. Because in a food situation where you love dairy, but it's actually causing you digestive issues, the question then becomes, well, what do you really want? Do you want health, or do you want the dairy? And whichever one you really want is what you're going to get.
Right, because you can't have both.
Yeah,
that's what I learned. I could have vanilla ice cream, or I could, live. Those were the two choices I finally realized.
Yeah, and in a magical context, the reason I learned that is I was trying to do a debt reduction spell, and it backfired horribly, and I'd never had a spell backfire on me ever before. And I was like, what is going on? Surely debt reduction is what I want. And it turned out that what I really wanted was the punishment of the debt. I decided I needed to be punished. And once I understood that that was what I actually wanted, once that became knowledge,
right,
able to say, well, that's ridiculous. Why would I want that? And isn't it better to have a better way to live?
See, and that's something too that I think just in the terminology of fairy tradition, we will talk about the individual having 3 souls, or perhaps 3 parts to the soul. And this really kind of brings up a whole conversation about what is free will, because we think, oh, I know what I want. This is what I want, but that's what your head wants. That's what we would call the talker. That's what talker wants, right? But that's what we usually identify as ourselves. So yeah, I know what I want, but our fetch, our primal soul, has way different ideas, because to the primal soul, it's your animal nature, your child nature. All time is now. It's really closely related to the body, right? So any of the trauma that we've experienced, you know, in our lives is right there, right? I actually will use the idea of a money spell to illustrate this. You know, I could be like, oh yeah, I need $600 in order to make my mortgage, right? So I'm going to do a money spell for $600. But maybe when you were like 4 years old, you heard your mom say, the love of money is the root of all evil, you know, and you took that on, right? And so to the fetch, it's still there. It's still now. It's this complex. It's still alive, even though Taka forgot about it, right? So now we're doing our spell, and we're going to raise our energy, but we have to engage the fetch, because fetch is what actually gathers life force and actually will deliver our prayer to the God soul, what we call the holy daemon. Well, if the fetch is like, oh no, love of money is the root of all evil, I don't want to be evil. Now fetch is not on board, and talker can do all it wants to. You know, you could cast your circle, and you could do your sigils, and you could do your vision boards and like all of that. But if fetch isn't on board, it ain't happening. You're not getting the energy to do it. Your prayer is not being delivered. So this is where I feel like, oh, free will is something we have to cultivate, because we have to work with the shadow. That, you know, the fetch holds the shadow, and we have to shine a light in there and see what's in there. And then you undo that rock, and you see all those creepy crawlies, and you have to deal with it. Okay, well, I've got this complex that says that the love of money is the root of all evil. What am I going to do about that? Now I have to do some cleansing work on that. I have to confront that head on and actually heal that wound in fetch, so that now fetch can be okay with it. And maybe now I can do my work, you know, to get my mortgage paid. But if we ignore what's going on in fetch, we do so at our own peril.
I think that's brilliant and so well explained. I really, really appreciate that.
Thank you.
And I've read, well, no, I haven't heard. I've heard people try to explain it. You explain it extremely well, so I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, I've had some practice.
I've only been doing this my whole life. You know, one of the things, I used to be a general manager of an occult store 20 blah, 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 years ago. And I became a massage therapist, and I said at one point, I'm like, hey, I want to open my own store. And I would save and save and save, and then something would happen. And I would start again and save and save and save, something would happen. Then recently in the last year, you know, I do like hospice work when I'm called and things like that. And I had a good friend say, hey, Chris, you know, you actually write books about this. Why are you not doing hospice work? And I'm like, because it never occurred to me. I don't know why. Because I do it for free. That's why. And so I decided to take something that's called clinical pastoral education. So if you're a priest, you can become a chaplain intern at hospitals and hospices. When I was doing that work, I was so happy. I was in tears. I was like, this is it. And it was so funny because they give you a piece of paper for other people you're supposed to see that day, the patients. And this happened a few times too, where I saw, I'm just going to make it up, a patient on floor 7 in room 23. And I would go there, and then all of a sudden, the person's dying, and I would have to do, well, I would do energy work and prayers and be with the family. And it just so happened that they died on the spot. I swear this happened twice. I looked at the page and it wasn't on the page. I had actually seen it somehow, because there was a death, something, a spirit, a deity, whatever, calling me there. But my point is that for years, I tried to save up because I wanted an occult store, a magical store, and it never freaking happened. But then all of a sudden, without even trying, I get pulled into this. Like seriously, someone held me by the hand and took me. I'm like, yeah, because somewhere I had it in, as you say, my fetch or something that, no, you're not supposed to be doing this work. You're supposed to be doing something else. And I also learned that this whole ageism thing, get that out. Because I think sometimes you go in phases. I do believe in you are where you're supposed to be at age 20, 30, 40, 50, but sometimes you don't find your dream until 40, 50, 60, 70. And I think that's okay, you know?
Absolutely.
So I really resonate hard with what you're saying.
Yeah, I think something else to that is that, in the first example, Fetch had a complex that we needed to work on, but the reverse could be true, where, Fetch maybe has your best interests at heart in some cases, or maybe it's the God soul, your God soul, your holy daemon is saying, no, that's not really your evolutionary path, and so I'm not going to manifest that for you because that's not, for your highest good, as we'll say, and I think a lot of the work, it's working both ways, right? Because we recognize that, well, if I'm a triplicity, and the three parts of myself, have different drives and different desires and different perspectives, it really is about aligning them and getting them to communicate so that we can make an educated decision together, as opposed to just the talker trying to get whatever the talker wants.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, I normally have something to say, but I'm like, oh, let me just absorb this. This is awesome.
I have something to say. I know I said I wasn't going to say anything today, but I do have something to say. And I'm fascinated to hear Storm Faerywolf talking about everything they're talking about, especially as I see and breathe and walk through this earth on tarot and the language of the tarot cards. And this three self spirit division is exactly what the journey of the hero and the tarot is. So I'm fascinated. I'm also grateful to hear you speak about how your tradition, the tradition that you practice, is about self-development and self-growth, and it's not about Disney fairies. Because a lot of people who might be inclined to do serious work and growth on their soul, guilty as charged, might be misled by the name of the tradition, thinking is something that is light or shallow or superficial. So I'm very thankful for you to be so deeply and with such passion speaking about your tradition, because I'm here to learn and I have. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's something that I deal with fairly early on in my book, Betwixt and Between. This idea that, because you see so many people, especially like in the New Age movement, which is that still a phrase that's being used?
Yep, sure.
Yeah,
and people will say, "Oh, the fairies, and the fairies are just here to bless you, and they're there to give you love." And it's the same thing with like angels, right? Like the whole Doreen Virtue angel thing. I know she's since renounced it, but this idea that like, oh, all they are is the embodiment of love. Never mentioning that, of course, in biblical times, whenever an angel would show up, the first thing they would say is, "Do not be afraid, because dear, you were afraid because they were scary as fuck." Excuse me, but they wheels of fire and 16 wings and eyes, and they're so outside of reality, and they're these huge raw powers, right? And really, the Fae have been, if you look back in folklore, they were not these cutesy little things. Sure, some of them could show up small, but that didn't mean they didn't bite, and a lot of them, a lot of the magic that is recorded in folklore about the Fae, most of it is how to protect yourself from them, because sometimes they could be considered malicious, really, just like any human. Really, it's just like, who are you going to meet, right? You're going to meet somebody who's a jerk, or are you going to meet somebody who's an ally? And the same thing happens in Fae, in Fairy. In folklore, they'll talk a lot about the Seelie and the unseelie court, right? And really, this is a human projection onto this huge nebulous you know, kaleidoscopic experience that is, you know, the fairy. But we say, oh, the Seelie, I say we, I don't say it, but the Seelie is supposed to be those that are good, meaning allied with humans. They're going to help you. And the Unseelie are the ones that are bad, the ones that are going to curse you, right? And really, the reality is all over the map. There is no such thing as like just the Seelie or the Unseelie. This weird binary. We tend to want to put things into binaries so often. It's so black and white. And it just, life isn't that way. It's every color, it's every shade, everything is happening. And something can still be good. You know, I think lions are good. I think nature's good, but you know, a lion could maul you because it's a wild animal. It doesn't mean that it's evil. It means it was hungry, you
And
know, and
I'm sorry,
yes.
speaking of names, you know, when I heard people, because it's becoming more common that people hear Pachamama, Pachamamita, because it's such a, I don't know, kind of rolls of the tongue. So even people who don't speak Spanish now know and say Pachamama or Pachamamita. And it sounds so welcoming and so loving. And it's got the mother there, right? The mama or the mamita. And they're like, oh yeah, la Pachamamita. And I'm like, think again, because it's the power of the earth. So, you know, it's not your loving, caring mother that is going to present like a little fairy again on that.
Right.
It is this strong force of the volcanic center of the planet. So it's not
Yeah.
because the name is Pachamamita, I think it's like something cutesy. So
Yeah, we have this idea, this archetype of the mother, right? And you're like, oh, she's in the kitchen and baking cookies, and she's gonna kiss your boo boo and whatever. But you know, let's think about the mama grizzly, you know, who's protecting her young, and she will mess you up, and rightly so, right?
yep,
And
yep.
that's part of the mother archetype as well. And I think that just gets shoved off to the side, you know. One other thing I wanted to say, just based on, because you were talking about the tarot, and kind of relating it back to where we're talking about the three souls. I often think of the Lover's card, you know, especially in like the Rider-Waite, you know, where you have, you know, the man and the woman, and they're together, and the angel is up over them both, right? And you have the man traditionally who's looking at the woman, but the woman is looking up at the angel. And this is actually a really good symbolic or pictorial example of how the three souls, perfect, yeah, exactly. Laura's holding it up.
Oh, yeah,
Say
they can
something
see it.
while you hold it up, because then it'll get recorded.
I will say something while I'm holding it up. I will say, if you read the tarot and tell somebody this is about loving a partner, you're mistaken.
Right, yeah. To me, it's about kind of bringing all of our parts together. It's this grand divine synthesis, right? And the stereotype, I hate to be limited by gender roles, but what we're talking about here in terms of like that tarot card, the male figure would represent the talker, you know, the kind of the conscious mind. The female figure would represent the fetch, the unconscious. And then of course you have the angel, which is the God soul. And if the talker wants to communicate, wants to send a prayer to the God soul, it has to go through fetch. And then vice versa, it comes to the talker via the fetch. So looking at the Lover's card, that is a really good example, a pictorial example of how we believe that the three souls actually communicate.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
That's awesome. I'm over here just like, oh, I think I'm supposed to say something now. It's just like, I'm just like, I want to crawl into your head and just see what's all in there.
It's
It's
interesting
very
because
whack.
I'm just fascinated by everything you're saying, because I actually have never been initiated into a fairy tradition, but everybody, I'm supposed to be this fairy expert. I wouldn't call myself an expert. I just like working with what you and I would describe as fairy spirits, otherworldly beings. And to hear you talk about your tradition, it's just so resonant with me, because I'm like, these are things that I have kind of been learning through the Fae, and it seems like this is just a concept that is running through our universe, that this is a very tangible, very effervescent, it's there. I feel like you don't necessarily need to be inducted into a specific tradition, because what you're talking
Right.
about, these themes and concepts, they're real, they're manifest, and they are there for anyone to reach out and learn. So
Absolutely.
it's so exciting
Absolutely.
to hear lessons that I've been creeping out on my own, like articulated in your very specific tradition. When you
Yeah, I totally agree
souls,
with
I was
you.
like,
Yeah, I totally agree with you. No, but I would say, I mean, I'm going to be very careful how I say this, but I don't think that anybody needs to be initiated into anything in a formal way, you know. Now, individually, you might need to be, because maybe your soul is calling you to be. I was really called to be initiated into Anderson Feri Tradition, and it was good for me. Was it the be all end all of my spiritual practice? Absolutely not. But it gave me some extra tools. It gave me a level up. I do think that any good initiation is really just about quickening your spiritual evolution, you know, kind of speeding things up, you know, for you, maybe giving you access to a current of power that maybe you didn't have access to before. But at the core of all of this, I think it's really about animism. It's about working with spirits, you know, recognizing that everything has an indwelling spirit, absolutely everything. And the only thing we need to do is to quiet down and to learn how to listen and to pay attention to those spirits. And the spirits are going to teach you directly. You don't necessarily need a human teacher, you know, to teach you certain things, you know. And here I am, I'm a human teacher, right? So I'm trying to put myself out of business. But I think that really, especially like depending on where you are, maybe you don't have access, you know, to a teacher, you know, in a tradition. I actually teach over Zoom and Discord, you know, so I kind of got rid of that restriction, you know, early on. And when I started teaching long distance, I got a lot of blowback, you know, from other initiates in my tradition who were saying, "Oh, that's impossible. You can't possibly teach, you know, long distance, whatever." And I'm thinking, well, we're supposed to be witches, you know, warlocks, you know, whatever. If we believe in the power that we're using, if I can cast a spell that's going to affect somebody that's not in my house, why can't I create an energetic situation in which we can connect over long distance, you know? And so I've been teaching this way now for many years. I don't want to figure out how many. I'll feel older than I already do. But yeah, I don't think that that nobody needs to have a human teacher. It's not going to validate you or otherwise. Really, your quality as a witch or a spiritual practitioner is all about the work that you put in, you know, personally. You know, what I think my job is as a teacher of a specific tradition is, as someone who has been keyed into these, we work with specific spirits, you know, so specific deities and whatnot. My job is to kind of open those doors for people and to kind of hold them open and maybe kind of help facilitate and maybe give my guidance on how I think that student might best connect. But it's always a learning experience, right? This is not a cookie cutter experience. You know, it's one size does not fit all. You know, so my job is to kind of then be dynamic, like, oh, okay, well, this method isn't working for you. Well, let's make something else up. Let's try to figure it out. But ultimately, once you connect to those spirits and you have a personal relationship with them, well, all bets are off. You don't need me for that anymore. You have that part of it, you know, and you can learn directly from them. And that's really, if you even looking back on folkloric witchcraft, you know, I mean, we don't really see in folkloric witchcraft the idea of covens and traditions. First of all, you have individuals who are basically like, I don't want to live with other people, you know, because I'm other, and probably you're all annoying me, and so I'm going to go off into the woods, and I'm going to live in my hut or whatever, and people will then come to me because, you know, they need help or whatever, and maybe they'll bring me some chickens or, you know, whatnot in order to pay for it. But this idea of like witches and covens and stuff, I mean, part of that is really new. You know, a lot of it comes from the witch trials. And I think there's some validity to it in terms of an astral experience. You know, I work with the idea of the grand Sabbat, you know, this idea, the witches' Sabbat, you know, where they'd go and they'd dance around the bonfire and have a feast, and it was this big orgy or, you know, whatever. And I think there's some validity to that on the astral. And I think this is actually where you get the idea of like the sabbatic craft, you know, comes from, that this is actually an astral event, you know, that is happening, you can tap into. And Feri actually resonates with that really well. We work with a lot of inner temples, and this idea that like we're working with the unseen world in these many different forms. So I feel like I'm losing my train of thought, but
no, that's okay. You can just say whatever you want to and talk. You know, a couple of things I was thinking about. I think one of the biggest challenges that people have, and I teach a lot of similar styles of ecstatic witchcraft and shamanic style of witchcraft and things, and we always get the same question: am I making this up? And I say, yes, you are, but that's okay, because the spirits are using your imagination to teach you. Because the first thing I say is, if you don't have an imagination, I'm gonna help you practice to get one, because the energies, the gods, the ancestors, whoever, the Fae, they work with your imagination, and they're gonna speak with symbols and sets that resonate with you. That's why I keep saying the Greek gods look like the Greeks. The Egyptian gods looked at the Egyptians, because that was their symbols and sets. You know?
Right, absolutely. And I'm so glad that you brought that up, that you mentioned ecstasy, because that is, you know, the ecstatic experience is really at the heart of Anderson Feri witchcraft.
That's
you know,
awesome.
In fact, it's one of those things that often gets used as a descriptor to kind of differentiate ourselves from other forms of modern witchcraft, most notably Wicca. You know, so a lot of times we'll say, well, Wicca is a fertility-based tradition, whereas Feri is an ecstasy-based tradition. Now, that's a little much, you know, that's not exactly entirely true. That it kind of implies that Wicca doesn't have ecstasy, and that's not true. But in general, you know, that's kind of how we're not really focused on the fertility aspect. We're not really focused on the agricultural wheel of the year, although we can. You know, we've stolen like everything from Wicca, pretty much. You know, we cast a circle, a quartered circle, you know, those things. I was actually encouraged by my initiator when I went to start teaching Feri. You know, he told me, maybe don't teach casting the circle, because that's not really Feri. That was borrowed from Wicca, which is true. It was borrowed from Wicca, but no pun, but why reinvent the wheel? You know, it's a great form. It works. And I think that a good witch will use anything that works.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you find something that has power, as long as you're being respectful with it, especially if that comes from, you know, somebody else,
Mm-hmm.
especially another culture, you know, I really think you have to watch that and to be respectful of how you might be doing that. And that's tricky. And I will say that's extra tricky, I will say, in Feri, because in the early days in Feri tradition, people were very cavalier, you know, about where they got things. And so we've got Celtic stuff, there's African stuff that shows up, there's Hawaiian stuff, Welsh, Middle Eastern, you know, and I've tried my best to kind of parse that out and to kind of give credit where credit's due. But one example is one of the core exercises of our tradition is often called Kala, K-A-L-A, and it purports to be from Hawaiian. And it's this personal cleansing exercise, and it's beautiful. It just uses a glass of water, and you would charge this glass of water in various ways, and then you drink this water to kind of take this transformed energy, you know, back into you. But the more that I practiced with it, the more I recognized that, well, this probably isn't directly from Hawaiian to begin with. This is probably a white person's idea of what was Hawaiian, kind of like Huna. You know, it was at one time believed that Huna was a Hawaiian tradition. No, it's a New Age religion that was made up, or practice, I'll say, that was made up by a white person who believed, maybe, if I'm giving him, you know, benefit of the doubt, believed that it was based on Hawaiian stuff, but it wasn't. And so I actually don't call it Kala anymore, because I figured, you know what, I'm done with appropriating these people. You know, Hawaiian people have their own culture. I don't speak Hawaiian. I have no right to it. but the technology that I was taught is valuable. It's a very valuable tool. So now I refer to it as the waters of purity, because I feel that's more accurate in how to describe it. But I'm not erasing the Hawaiian connection, because I also want to give props to them as well, because if it did indeed come, from that in some form, I don't want to be guilty of erasure either, but I don't want to continue to take something from a culture that isn't mine without being able to give back to that. And I think that that's really the key, is that if we are going to be taking some sort of practice, or if we've been given some practice, I was actually taught smudging from an Apache medicine woman 30 years ago, right? And so that's something that I still love, but also things are a little different now. White sage is becoming endangered, so we have to find, if we're going to keep using it, we have to find sustainable ways, of doing it. It's become really this big commodity, in the spiritual communities. That's not really what was intended, so we do have to adjust our relationships to those things as well. I still love the practice, but I'm not going to be buying any more sage anytime soon.
If I may add something real quickly, as one of the color people minority here, I think it is very important that we speak about appropriation and giving back to the culture, but also, in all fairness and being very, very fair, people who are not people of color have ancestry, and I promise you, I guarantee you, I can almost swear on fire, if you trace your ancestry, there's going to be one shape, way, or form that what you are looking from a culture of people of color was done in your ancestry culture in a slightly different way.
Yeah.
But because there's nothing new under the sun. And all
Right.
these cultures and all these traditions, as you said in the beginning, based on animism and shamanism and the earth. So there is going to be something similar. And then when you fuse the two of them, you become with your very own personal practice,
Yeah,
So
I'm so glad that you said that, because one of the things that really struck me, I had this experience where I took a class in root work and hoodoo from Kat Ironwood of Lucky Mojo years ago, and she would have these hoodoo heritage festivals where you'd go for like a long weekend and hear all these speakers, and they'd share different magics and everything. Well, one of the people that she had, I can't remember his last name, his first name was Johannes, and he wrote a book called Trolldom, and he was talking about trolldom and the practice of it, and I was so struck that this was the same thing as conjure and hoodoo. It was just in a different culture. They used some different herbs because it was what was happening in Sweden, but they still had, even like the Bible elements were there, like, oh, read these Psalms while you're putting these herbs in this bag, whatever. And I was like, oh my God, I don't want to say it's the same thing, because that really gives the wrong impression, but it draws from the same well. And what I discovered was that, oh, the common denominators here are animism and human consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And also then your surroundings, and that in your surroundings, your environment is going to give it a different flavor. Your particular culture is going to give it a different flavor. And I'm not saying this as a means to say, oh, it's a free for all, you can just take whatever, because that's exactly not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is there is something deeper, and I think that if you just, again, going back to what Ruby Ruse was talking about, like, oh, just learning directly from the spirits, from the Fae themselves, if you're given stuff from the spirits, that's yours, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're not taking that from anybody, that was freely given. But it is, I do think that it's important, if we are going to be inspired by certain cultural practices, and especially if we are going to adopt those, we really need to make sure that we're doing it in a respectful way. And part of that would be to give back to that community. If there are living people in that culture, we're not talking about like, oh, the ancient Greeks, or the Sumerians, whatever. But there's people today, and a lot of those people were actually barred from doing those very practices.
Yep.
You know, and so I think it's very important to make sure that we're doing something respectful and that we're giving back, that we're not just taking. You know, it has to be reciprocal.
You know, growing up with my father, who was a New Ager when New Ager was actually New Age, and it was kind of like a science thing. Learn how to heal with hands, and my whole life I've done healing with hands, and now I'm a witch for hire, as I said earlier. And when I tell people, you know, I do healing with hands. Oh, so do you do Reiki? So I'm like, no, let me go learn Reiki. So now I know Reiki. So now I can tell people, yes, I do Reiki. And I can, because I have from my dad and from what I learned, put it together, and that's what I offer, you know. Yeah, this is how Laura heals with hands, you know. But it's always good to hear people, authors particularly, who have this consciousness of let's let's stop colonizing everything, you know, and give credit what credit is due. So thank you for that again.
We're at the hour, and so I would like to ask us, Storm, do you have any closing thoughts, sentiments, reflections before we go?
Well, I just want to say thank you for giving me this opportunity to be able to speak with you all. This is what I love to do. I was talking with Chris earlier before we started recording. I'm a Gemini moon. And so I just love to talk and parse it all out. If I could take just a moment, again, a shameless plug. I just want to say my book, you could buy my book if you want to. I think it's pretty good. Betwixt in Between. And then there actually is a follow-up, Forbidden Mysteries of Fairy Witchcraft. And this actually goes deeper into the fairy work and working in a folkloric fairy way, also to work with the shadow. So there's a lot of talk about shadow work, divine possession, because that's definitely something that we work with in the fairy tradition as well. Oh, you have it, Ruby Ruse, yay. Thank you, appreciate the support. So, you know, if anybody was interested, those books are out there. You can get them from my store's website, themysticdream.com. I offer signed copies just at cover price, or you can get them from Amazon or hopefully your local metaphysical retailer, because shopping local, especially now during this pandemic, during the lockdown, we really need to make sure that we're supporting small businesses. My own store was a brick and mortar store. 30 years, we owned it for 13. We actually closed it in March because of COVID, because there was just no way to maintain paying Bay Area rent if we weren't allowed to actually have anybody walk in the door. But we are online now, so themysticdream.com, you could check us out. But if you have people who are close to you and you and people, try to support those businesses now, because a lot of small businesses are hurting.
Thank you so much. I am so grateful that you're here with us. I learned a lot about fairy and about you and about the tradition. I'm so excited. I'm like, wow. You guys, I read the books, but it's a completely different experience to hear you. I want to say in person, but at least on Zoom, whatever.
Well, that's just the closest we can get right now.
I know. It's like, I can touch you. I could almost touch you. And anyway, I want to thank everyone who attended in the audience. And for those of you who don't know, we are on YouTube. So we record the show, and then as soon as I remember or have time, I put it on YouTube. And we're also on Spotify and iTunes, and I think some other podcasts, but I don't remember right now. But anyway, thank you so much. I'm going to stop the recording and open it up to questions. So you guys have a wonderful evening.